So, got a few things for us to talk about. One is the Federalist Papers assignment, but to make sure we leave enough time for the discussion of the Spooner text, let's begin there. I left you all with a couple of questions at the end of class yesterday, one of which was discussion of the nature of the authority of the Constitution. Where does it get its authority? And then the other one was, given the option, would you sign it? And then as consequent to that, would you sign it? If you would sign it, would you sign it if it obliged all of your descendants? So with that, let's hear from each of you. What's your response to those questions?
As far as where the Constitution gets its authority, I don't know, I was thinking like a way to try to justify it. And I thought if you looked at it as a contract, but not necessarily a legal contract, but as almost like an economic endeavor, the state is providing goods, or in this case, services. And that way it might justify the Constitution's authority, because in general, if you're using a service, then you should probably pay for it. And with that in mind, like I guess it's sort of Socratic argument, but if you are, it seems like in a state, you're benefiting from their protection from invasion, from relative protection or justice if wrong is done to you. Obviously not perfect, but better than if you were on your own. So it seems like if you are in a state, then you are benefiting from the services it provides. So whether or not, so I guess if you're benefiting from the services, then it seems just that you have to pay for it in some way, whether that be taxation, or if you're using the services, then you are consenting in some way.
What if you're only using the services because you're not being given the chance to choose a better option?
I don't know. That was actually a question I had, because he was saying like, that you're forced to vote. You don't have any other options. But I was wondering, I didn't quite understand how you were forced, because you can renounce your, at least in the context of American government, you can just leave. You can renounce your citizenship and move to New Zealand or Europe, or like you're not really, you have a lot of options actually.
Was he saying?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. What's that? Sorry, mine's all glitchy. I was just saying, yeah, it seems like if you're so disgruntled with the Constitution or how things are run here, you could expatriate yourself and go somewhere else, and like that's a viable option. It seems like by virtue of staying, yeah, you might have complaints against how things are run, but obviously you're not so upset that you want to go somewhere else. And it seems like if there was a widespread discontent and the government overall lost trust in the government, it could be overthrown, and states have gone that way. And so, I don't know, it seems like so long as the government maintains a viable public trust, their legitimacy, Max Weber has kind of that idea of legitimate authority. So long as it maintains a front of legitimacy and people all acknowledge it, then it is therefore legitimate. So that's, I did have a thought, kind of from a tangent from Ryan's, on whether or not it actually is the same thing as a mere legal contract. It seems like it's like a meta contract, because it establishes the legal authority. Like you don't have a universally acknowledged court system until you have a constitution. So there has to be something that goes behind it to actually enforce those decisions. And so that was one kind of complaint I had against Spooner's argument.
Yes,
to
sir.
moving around, not everybody can afford to do that either. If they do, they're not content where they are, but they don't have the money or the resources to get out. Then I think they still should have some say in that, and it shouldn't be just taken automatically as consent if they're staying there.
Seems suboptimal to say that your only two options are put up with it or leave.
Yeah, let me make a couple of clarifying remarks. First, to Mr. Ayer's point about voting. Spooner wasn't saying that you were forced to vote. He's responding. Well, let me have one of you explain. What was his argument there about voting?
He basically said that not everyone gets to vote, and even if they can vote, they don't a lot of times. So that doesn't actually represent the majority's consent.
Wasn't
Right.
he arguing that voting isn't an action of consent because it's not something that we do voluntarily out of our own free will, so it doesn't count as voluntary consent.
And you're also voting for someone that's then in office for 2 years or 6 years or whatever the case is. So you're giving your consent for that person for that period of time. It's not perpetual. It doesn't just keep going, and it's not widespread. It should be limited to whoever you do vote for.
Bartlett, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it seems like Ryan was describing the tacit consent that we talked about, but I was wondering if you could remind me of what Locke's argument was for there having to be explicit or express consent or something like that. Why tacit isn't enough, just staying somewhere and benefiting from the things that the government provides.
Yeah. I'd have to review Locke. It's not coming to me. So the clarification I would make is that he's not saying that you're forced to vote. He's responding to the argument that voting implies consent. But that framework of voting, or what your options are, the terms under which the votes are being, the alternatives are being presented to you, that's not a matter of consent. So it wasn't saying that people are being forced to vote. It's just, he was just denying that voting implies consent. I want to come back to Chase's comment. I thought that his idea that the Constitution is a meta contract. I like that because that's how, as I was rereading Spooner, that's the concept that I had. But Chase, as I took it, you saw that as a liability of his argument, was potential, and I want to explore that further because does that put, you can go one of two directions. It's a meta contract. You can emphasize either the meta or the contract. If it's a meta contract, okay, but to what extent should it still resemble a contract, or do we emphasize the meta? That is to say, emphasize its difference from other contracts. Why do we have? Let me put it this way: why do we have the requirements, the legal requirements for a contract to be binding that we do? And presumably, it's because there's some sense of justice that is, or at least ought to be, animating how we approach contracts. And so then the question would be, well, is there any reason for those same standards of justice and fairness, if that's what they are, not to apply to the Constitution? Or is the fact that it's a meta contract just put it in a fundamentally different category, such that we're comparing apples and oranges? So I'm just kind of restating the question. Does the question make sense? And so what do you think about that?
I think if the Constitution actually posited itself as a meta contract, I would almost be more tempted to sign that for myself and for my posterity than the actual Constitution right now. If it was just setting the guidelines for what justice is in America, I would be much more tempted to sign that.
Well, I mean, it kind of does, in terms of it sets up who gets to legislate. So, I mean, how those laws are actually about to pass and lay out the law of the land. So in that sense, it does establish, we all agree, this is how we establishing, laws for the land. Because if you go back 18th century, and they really did 15 commandments, how much would those then change? And so it's rather an organic organism that takes over that role.
How about you, Mr. Merkel? I'm sure you have opinions about that.
Yeah, sorry, my audio is pretty bad, so it's really hard for me to follow what's going on. But so I'm wondering if we could talk about sort of the biblical concept of like when Israel goes into when they ask for a king, it's always just assumed that it's for their posterity as well. It seems like government is if there's a contract there, then it's a kind of contract which is covenantal and just sort of automatically applies to your children, and they might be able to leave, but they don't have to explicitly consent to it because of that sort of biblical understanding of the family.
Good. Yeah. What do you all think about that?
Is there an aspect to that, Knox, that's kind of a curse for your children? Like the curses, they're going to take your children, they're going to take part of your profit. The king is.
Well, yeah, but they still have to submit to it. It's like he says, you're putting all of your children under this, and this is sort of what justice is like. You're not necessarily justice in that sense, but to say that the children are in some sense responsible for the sins of the father. Like we all died in Adam, but the blessings of that covenantal connection are so much greater because, like, since we all died in Adam, how much more shall we live in Christ? There's that aspect to it as well.
I don't know, kind of related. I think it was Hooker that talked about the eternality of corporations. It was one of the people we read, but whoever it was, when I read it, I thought I was there's something true about that, or sympathetic to the idea at least, that it's beyond just a covenant between or compact between individuals, but the creation of a nation. There's something more permanent to it, and so it makes sense. I mean, even in the nature of things, humans have always, tribes, families, nations, countries, kind of thing. It spans generations, and there seems to be something right about that. But I don't quite know how to parse it.
Right. It's one of those things where we have to distinguish. There's the, like, what generally happens in human history, and then there's, okay, well, philosophically, what can we make sense of? But even in terms of history, basically there has been no perpetual nation, right? Nations come and go, and so that's an interesting question of whenever they go, is that like a death? Is that, well, I suppose in one sense it is. Is it something that ought not to happen? Or what are the terms under which it's reasonable for something that was brought into being, presumably for moral reasons, at least to the extent that the reasons it came into being are moral? What could there ever be reasons for it to go out of being, and what would those be? And that's part of what we're trying to explore here. But I want to come back to Mr. Merkel's point, and because I think you make a good point, although this is in part what I was trying to touch on with the discussion of Does the Bible, in other words, does the Constitution have different standards for government than the Bible itself? Right. So let's say it's the case that in the Old Testament, I think it generally is, the understanding was, I doubt that the Old Testament Israelites thought in terms of, okay, well, I agreed to this covenant, but now my children need to as well. Although, I don't know. Now that I say that, there's probably a respect in which they did think that in every generation is having to affirm. We get renewal of covenant. But in any case, I think you're at least right that generally it's not like they were as obsessed with principles of consent. Right? Basically, they weren't modern Americans. When I say modern, I would include here, the early republic of the U.S. So, given that Old Testament Israel generally, like they didn't have a constitution, and if they did, it wouldn't have looked like our constitution. So I'm just trying to bring out there's a real difference between how the American framers were thinking about this, and it seems like they were concerned to put constraints, the kind of constraints on government that it just doesn't strike me were a preoccupation in the Old Testament. Put that however you wish. I'm not trying to make an argument here. I'm just trying to capture something that I would assume we would all take for granted. Is it, so even, basically I'm saying, even if you were right, Mr. Merkel, does that mean, it's not necessarily the case that the Constitution, like somebody later could still try to create a nation, let's say, that was radically consent-based, let's say, regardless of whether the Constitution was that way or not. Is that a liberty that a people might have, given, granted that the Old Testament, that wasn't really a concern? And if so, where would that leave us as, where would that leave that people? Does that make sense? If their own constitution had stricter standards, stricter limits for itself than the Bible itself put on it, such that, let's say that was part of the Constitution, that was in the sorry, I keep going on and on here, but still trying to formulate this question. Let's say it was written into the Constitution that every generation, everybody had to consent to it. Would we see that as inherently unbiblical because we don't have an exact antecedent for that in the Bible, or is it still a biblical option? Basically, it seems to me that's the question that your rejoinder leaves us with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the United States is a very different kind of country than Israel was, because they're the covenant people of God, and America as a nation is not. Like, we're sort of purely a political organization, not religious. And so it does seem like there are going to be different standards. But not entirely different, because Israel was still political.
Right. Yeah, what are the thoughts on that?
It doesn't seem like the classic passages in Romans or along those lines put a limit on the kind of government, just the respect that you ought to show to the government that you are placed under. So I don't think I see a problem with setting up a beneficial form of government and then paying fealty to whatever you've set up.
No, and I think that would certainly apply in any case. Yeah, even if you had a radically consent-based government, I think, would that basically, to rephrase our question, would that be if Spooner had his way, let's say, and everybody, for the Constitution to be binding, you had to consent to it, would that be a scenario where Romans 13 no longer applied? in which case that would be an argument against, at least a biblical argument against Spooner's ideal. Or would it be a situation which, no, Romans 13 would still apply? You know, if you consent to a government, then you are obligating yourself to support that government insofar as it keeps up its end of the bargain. You know, and I don't think Buchanan is quite at the place where Spooner is, but it seems to be something like that with Buchanan's reading, for what it's worth.
So I think Romans 13 would definitely still apply in radically consent-based government, because you have to have respect for the law, and if the law says, if the law allows for more liberty, then that's totally fine. But I don't think Spooner's argument holds in that a government has to be radically consent-based. Like, if it is, then that's totally a biblical option, and Romans 13 would still apply. But because we have an example of political organization which was not radically consent-based, then I don't think that the governments have to be that way.
Good.
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but
You might have to speak up. You already have a soft voice, and it's hard to hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I think present.
Okay, let me know if you can't hear me. Yeah, I'm not sure if this actually answers your question, but it does seem like even with a consent-based, radically consent-based government, you still would have to submit in some ways, because if it is a contract, then yes, the state, you only have to obey the state insofar as it fulfills its side of the contract, but you also have to fulfill your side of the contract, which I think, to tie it into the Civil War, I think that was at least Abraham Lincoln's argument for why the South shouldn't secede. Not that they didn't have the ability, but that they weren't, it wasn't a good enough reason. I'm not saying he's right, but just that, I guess, like, you would still probably, like, in a contract, you, citizen, would still have to put up with things you didn't like to fulfill your side of the bargain. Once it comes to violating your rights, or like the what the contract is based on, then you have the right to head out. It seems like you would still have to submit to some things that you may not like.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
I was curious how much you knew about Switzerland and their kind of re-vote. What was it, every 16 years? That was in that article you had us read. Do you know how that's working?
I don't. Yeah, it makes me curious. Yeah, did anybody else? So I didn't make it required. Did anybody else read that? The expiration date on the Constitution piece. Let me, for those interested, let me post the link. I had it up there earlier. It's good. Yeah, so to your question though, Ms. Story, I don't know anything about it beyond the article itself. So for those who didn't read it, so the title is "The Constitution," or was it posed as a question? Should the Constitution have a expiration date? And it begins by talking about how in not Switzerland, Sweden. Was it Sweden?
Switzerland.
It is Switzerland. Okay. I think it's Sweden on the brain. Yeah, Swiss. Okay. In Switzerland, it's not that they have their constitution goes up for election, but their direct taxation from the Swiss central government is something that has to be reapproved every so often. And most recently, it was in March 2018 was the last time they had their election. They moved to extend it for another 15 years. So it's this idea that, and what the article is arguing for in general is the difference, instead of setting something in place and then putting the burden on voters if they don't like it, they have to have a referendum to end something. Instead, frame your laws such that whenever governments want to do something, there's always this fixed limit. So the burden is on the government to continually show that it's worth renewing. So it just puts the burden of proof and where all the effort is in the right place. And so instead of government creating something and then citizens having to go through all the work to try to tear it down if it's bad, it goes the other way. And then he cites Thomas Jefferson at the end about how it's good to have the constitutional renewal every 18 or 20 years. Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting article, different way from how we view things. It seems like it would have a impetus towards smaller government, and just make it harder for government to get bigger, because every time it created something, it wasn't assumed that it was going to be there forever. It had to continue to persuade the citizenry of its merits. So yeah, I don't know anything else about it, but it was worth looking into. Not thinking you got the link there. Okay, well, anything else from Spooner? I don't know, did we, let's see. So how many would sign it right now? Like the entire country, Constitution's put up for a vote. Would you sign it right away, or wait and see, or absolutely not?
I think that's a really difficult question
It is, yeah.
right now, because we know where it has gone. So it's hard to say that we'd vote for it again, seeing that it went through the changes it did in the Civil War and later, and where we are today. Yeah, I don't know how we'd try to change it, or what a better option would actually look like, or if they're all just going to go downhill eventually and you have to start over, radically change it later.
Let me put it this way. Yeah, maybe, yeah. I don't think the way I phrased the question is probably the most helpful. How many of you would like the option, whether you'd sign it or not? You think it would be at least be you think it would be a better way to go? That it's just expected that if the government wants to hold it, apply the Constitution to somebody, they could get their consent first. Or are you okay with not having consented to it?
So do you mean would we sort of enjoy having that option, or do we think we ought to have that option?
Yeah, no, that's a good discussion. Either, I guess. I mean, I'm interested in both questions.
Both. I would go both.
I think I want more clarification on what constitutes secession, or on what grounds secession can happen, or I guess clarification on if you want to get out. If that could be clear, and then I'd be okay with signing me and kids off.
Yeah, no, that's good. So yeah, if you're given the option, you sort of want to know what you need to know what the options even mean. Yeah. So even if you were going to sign it, or thought it would be good to have it presented. It wouldn't make much of a difference if it was just a pro forma, perfunctory, let's just go through the motions. We're going to impose this on you either way. Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I'm not sure what, again, I'd still raise open the question, what is the alternative? What does it even mean to be presented with those choices? I guess I like the distinction Mr. Merkel makes. He gets back to our earlier discussion, and that is, there's having a preference for something. Okay, yeah, if I'm given the choice, but ought I to be? Does government have a moral obligation to present me with that choice? Spooner clearly seemed to think that there is. So one question we might pose would be, under what circumstances would government be under that moral obligation? Would the moral obligation only be there if it was written into the Constitution? That it had to be presented as a choice. Because it's not written into the Constitution. Spooner seems to infer it based on his kind of originalist reading of the Constitution as we read it as its original meaning, and it comes across as a contract, and so he's making that inference. Doesn't mean it's a right inference. I don't know if we want to discuss that, but that's just another question worth thinking about.
It seems like one of the main reasons Spooner does that is because the Constitution makes the claim of we the people, and that it almost seems to imply that the people have given consent. So on that point, I think I agree heavily with Spooner.
It does seem like if you reject the tacit consent, or like what I was saying at the very beginning, that theory, if you reject that theory, which Spooner does, it does seem like you have to have, the Constitution then has to have like a verbal, or not verbal, like a signed way of getting people's consent. It seems like the only, I could be wrong, but it seems like the only other option if you reject the tacit consent.
I just had it's not a philosophical concern, but a historical one. I had heard that the founders weren't even sure that it was gonna, like, they had a lot of doubts that it actually happen, like it actually be sustained, which is interesting. I'd read that or listened to that in some lectures, and yeah, apparently when it did in the next generation, the next couple decades, that it still stuck around. People were like surprised. So I kind of wonder if that had something to do with them not, I guess, covering the next generation, like what would happen when the next generation inherits this. They didn't really cover that in the terms. So I don't know.
Right. Okay. Well, anything else from Spooner that caught your attention that you were?
This is pretty unrelated, but I was wondering if you could compare Spooner facing slavery to us facing abortion today, because it seems like there'd be a lot of parallels there.
Good. And are you thinking about the constitutional issue in particular? How Spooner reads the Constitution?
Yeah, mostly that, but kind of in general too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think? Anybody? So we've talked about civil disobedience on the question of abortion in this class, but we haven't talked about abortion as a constitutional issue. Yeah, and the argument, like Roe v. Wade, the argument, I haven't even studied the issue of the legal side of abortion, but as you know, the the argument in Roe v. Wade was from the standpoint of a right to privacy, that everybody has a constitutional right to privacy. And when a woman gets an abortion, that her right to an abortion falls under the right to privacy. But people also have a right to life and liberty. So it seems like what you have there is a reading of the Constitution that's privileging this alleged right to privacy over right to life. And so, yeah, I could certainly see Spooner, anyone for that matter, any pro-life person arguing that the right to life is even if there were a right to privacy in the Constitution, it would be a strange document, certainly one that was rooted in the natural rights tradition that tried to privilege privacy over life. And so even if you argue that there was an ambiguity with regard to abortion in the Constitution, I think one certainly could argue from Spoonerian principles, premises, that where there's an ambiguity, you default in the direction of justice. And I think natural justice would say life always trumps privacy. I don't know, those are just some thoughts that come to my mind, but anybody else have thoughts there?
Would someone who's pro-abortion, would they consider the child as property since it's not human?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, the argument that woman has a right to her own body, there's implication being that the fetus is part of her body and therefore belongs to her. That would seem to follow from that starting point.
It's interesting. I've read that there's been a shift in the pro-abortion, pro-choice movement since Roe v. Wade. Originally, it was more on a fetus is not a person, so on the personhood of the fetus. But recently, that's been kind of left to the wayside, and now it's much more just a preference of rights. So whether or not the fetus is a person, the woman has a right, regardless. So in that sense, there's kind of a shift from the view of a fetus as property to just irregardless of the fetus.
Right. Okay, I guess we should read anything from the Federalist Constitution or the Federalist readings this week.
Can I ask another question about Spooner?
Sure.
Okay, I was wondering, it seemed like there's a contradiction, but I might just be not understanding what he was saying. It seemed like on page 11, he was talking about ballots versus bullets, and he was saying a man has no other alternative between voting or using his ballot and becoming a slave. He says, this case is analogous to that of a man who's been forced into battle where he must either kill others or be killed himself, which is very dramatic. But so I took that, and I could be wrong, but I took that as him saying that he's forced to use his ballot. But then on page 24, he was talking about what we were talking about earlier, how some people aren't permitted to vote, granted, but some people who are permitted to vote don't even vote. So it can't be a reliable form of consent from the people. But I was wondering, like, wasn't he just talking about in page 11 how you were forced to use that vote? Or is there a difference between a ballot and a vote?
I'm not sure. Do we have a different edition? What's your edition look like for page 11? Yours looks different than mine. Same picture of Spooner, but okay. So you're saying some people aren't allowed to vote or are allowed to vote and don't vote but then earlier he makes it sound like people are forced to vote. I think, but yeah, so I don't have the passage in front of me, but I think what he's talking about there is he thinks he approves of voting as a way of minimizing the damage, the injury done to oneself. So yeah, if you can go out and vote for one presidential candidate who's a lesser of two evils, who will steal from you at a lesser rate than the other, so there is a kind of necessity there, using the ballot box to try to just protect yourself. But he's not saying the necessity is one. It's a necessity by virtue on the assumption that you're trying to protect what's your own, but it's not a necessity in the sense that you have to vote or you'll die or you'll be killed or something like that. Does that make sense? At least that's my overall impression from him. I don't think he's saying that people are forced to vote. They're forced to vote if they want to try to use their vote to defend themselves, but it's a pretty meager defense, he would say. But yeah, I mean, he's talking about the modern democracies in the United States. People are not forced to vote. He knows that. So I don't think he's meaning to imply that. I don't know. Is that answering your question, Mr. Hayes?
That does, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
On a slightly unrelated note, the idea of paying the government taxes, but not quite taxes, more like a fee for their service after the service has been rendered, reminds me a lot of the end of Book 1 of the Republic.
Yeah. Although it wouldn't have to be right. That's where Socrates has the more economic model for ruler and the rules. That the ruler, if the ruler rules for the benefit of the ruled, then what does he get out of it? Well, you gotta pay him. You gotta compensate him. Although it wouldn't necessarily have to be the case. You pay him after the services are rendered. It could be before. You contract to say, okay, for this next year, I'd like you to police my streets. If I get into a conflict with my neighbor, I want you to adjudicate. If an army invades from elsewhere, I'd like you to protect us. So it could be, in all likelihood, would be something you would agree to. Or I would think the government would want the money up front, right?
I had a topic from the Federalist Papers.
Yeah.
Hamilton talks about, or maybe it was the other guy, Madison, I don't know, talks about the wars between the states, that the Constitution is necessary for that. I thought that was interesting. I mean, we kind of take it almost for granted that we have peace between the states. And I do wonder, and we've seen Europe in the last century, and we have our own civil war, but that's kind of another issue. But would we have more of a European experience where the states would be constantly at odds in a violent way, were it not for the Constitution, or could we have gotten along in a different way? I don't know.
Yeah,
I thought that was something that we're not often thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Much of our prosperity as a nation has been we've got all of these states, and they've except for the Civil War, gotten along, and that's provided a tremendous amount of peace. And where there's peace, there's opportunity for productivity, trading, and people improving their well-being, their standard of living. Yeah, I don't know. Other thoughts on that? Yeah, so I guess, I don't know, just in pretty broad statement here, and that is, it seems like, yeah, what you want is a peacekeeping force that, is able to keep two states from going to war with each other, and yet right? So it's able to check, and that's the glory, it's the beauty of having a national central government is, right? And you can think of that as Idahoans or residents of whatever state you are. Why would you, if you're a resident of a state, why would you also want to be a citizen of a national state? Well, you want your state to protect you against the national government, but you also want the national government to protect you against your state. And so that's the trick. How do you keep this balance? How do you keep them in check? Because that's what I think ideally the Constitution is trying to bring about with the Civil War, and the Spooner sees it is the scales get entirely tipped one way. That there's no, basically the war was the resolution of the principle that no, the states are not going to be in a position to keep the national government in check.
I had a question from the Federalist Papers. Maybe I didn't understand it, but I didn't get, I think it was in one of Alexander Hamilton's, how he was arguing that there'd be almost less lost revenue by having nationalized exports and imports versus statewide. Was I misunderstanding that?
I don't know. Do you have a page number? Or?
I don't think, I'd have to look for it. It would take me a second and we don't have enough time. But basically he was arguing that by having a national trade system, there'd be less individual contractors for international traders to work with.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, basically we'd say if individual states, if each individual state is working out its own trade agreements with, say, Great Britain, that's less efficient, less dependable than if Great Britain is able to have, just there's one trade agreement that it has to negotiate and works for all of the states. So, yeah, I guess potentially you could see how that would be the case, right? Think about, if you went to the extreme, let's say every county in the United States was in a position to negotiate its own trade agreement. How chaotic and inefficient that would be. So clearly, like the more, you could see a country like Great Britain just sort of thing, forget it. If I have to negotiate an agreement with every single town, this is too big of a nuisance. Now, is the alternative, okay, you just have one trade agreement with the entire country? There's a certain efficiency there, but it also depends on what kind of regulations the national government is imposing. Maybe it has more onerous restrictions than the individual state would like. And that's what basically, I shouldn't say basically, but at least a big part of what Brexit was about is if Great Britain has one set of standards or would like one set of standards for its products and its trade agreements, but then the European Union has other standards that are much more onerous and maybe favor other countries, then that's a pain for Great Britain, and they want it out. That's not all Brexit was about, but that's at least on the trade front. Okay, we are out of time. Thanks all for the discussion. Let you go, and any visitors who want to hang out and chat could either be about this class or oh, by the way, a quick announcement. On Populi, there is now should be an assignment for the term paper where you can upload your paper, which is due 5 o'clock tomorrow. Just upload it as, if you could upload it as a Word document, that might be preferable. If you can't, that's fine, but if you can, upload it as a Word document.
What would be your second preference to a Word document?
Anything that I can open with Word.
Is a PDF okay?
PDF would be fine, or maybe a Google Doc. I'm just trying to think. I haven't decided yet how I want to annotate. And PDFs are my experience doing with clunkier, but so basically, first preference, Word document if you can. After that, unless particular. So,
Thank you.
Yep. And visitors, if you want to stick around, we can chat about this class or anything else related to NSA. It doesn't have to be about this class.